Korea. Ko meaning high and Ryu meaning clear. Korea harbors more than 4,000 years of myth and history. But its claim to being the land of the morning calm is mocked by a tortured history of domination, war, and a land divided. Still, Korea today boasts a dynamic 20th century momentum. There is throughout the Republic of Korea a growing vitality, underscored by technological progress and ever-increasing self-reliance. And yet, in the midst of accelerating change, historic figures and shrines continue to recall long ago legends and dynasties. And the fertile Korean earth is still worked by men who cling to labors born during centuries past. Still mocking the legend of Korea as the land of the morning calm is the grim reality of the armed conflict, which only 2 decades ago ravaged and scarred this divided country, leaving permanent reminders of the price paid to preserve individual freedom and national security. Here at Busan, in the United Nations Memorial Cemetery, more than 2,000 markers eternally symbolize the more than 94,000 United Nations soldiers, airmen, and sailors who paid the supreme price during 3 years of war. Out of war and death, a country's right to survive, rebuild, and prosper through self-determination has been preserved. And for more than 20 years now, the American serviceman has continued to represent the United Nations and America's mandate to sustain the Republic of Korea's territorial security. And for what reason is the American serviceman and the United Nations forces still in Korea? For one continuing essential purpose: to help peace survive. Since July 27, 1953, the guns in Korea have been mostly silent. But the continuing ideological conflict between North and South has made Panmunjom a setting for psychological warfare, carried on by North Korea through volumes of accusations, tabletop belligerency, along with overt and covert acts of aggression. These hostile acts directed against United States and Republic of Korea military personnel over the years since the truce are documented reminders as to how fragile still is the morning calm in Korea. The roots of North Korea's hostility and aggression have been deep, their origin unknowingly seeded at another conference site, Cairo, Egypt. There in 1943, the Big Three held an historic World War II meeting. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek, then leader of mainland China, along with high-level military and civilian advisors, focused their attention on post-war liberation of countries and peoples, including Korea. The Cairo conference included a declaration that Korea's long and repressive occupation by Japanese military forces would be ended by Allied liberation, followed in due course by Korea becoming a free and independent country. 2 years later, the Potsdam Conference, with the Soviet Union's voice added, reaffirmed the pledge made in Cairo to stabilize Korea as one free and independent nation. But the physical liberation of Korea turned out to be Soviet Union style, which by its alarming spread suddenly threatened to become a unilateral occupation of all Korea, contrary to the agreements at Cairo and Potsdam. Concerned American foreign policy planners pinpointed the now famous 38th parallel as a necessary stopping point for Soviet forces. South of that line, liberation would be carried out by the United States. As World War II ended in 1945, Korea found itself a divided nation, despite our efforts to create a free and independent country. The Soviet Union assumed firm control in North Korea, frustrating efforts of a joint commission working to unify the country. All traffic into the north was sealed off. The question of Korea became a United Nations concern in 1947. The UN's efforts to hold supervisory free elections throughout Korea were blocked in the north by the Soviet Union. Only in the south was an election held. The Republic of Korea was created and a national legislature elected with provisions for North Korean representation if and when elections could be held there. Syngman Rhee became the first president. These free elections in the south produced the only legal government in Korea. In December 1948, the Soviet Union, in a surprise move, announced that she had removed her occupation troops from North Korea. We found ourselves compelled to do the same in the South, except for a small U.S. Army advisory group, which remained at the request of the Korean government. The question of a unified Korea remained unanswered. The future of the South Korean people was another anxious American concern. North Korea's plan for unifying Korea was made known to the world on June 25th, 1950, and it was by military invasion. As 6 divisions of North Korea's People's Army slammed into the Republic of Korea. Within 3 days, their rolling thrust had seized the capital city of Seoul. Korea had suddenly become a hot Cold War crisis. In our capital, reaction was dramatic and swift. President Truman immediately offered our military assistance to help stem and repel North Korean aggression. Another voice, that of the United Nations, quickly condemned North Korea's aggression, and in a series of emergency meetings called upon UN members to assist the Republic of Korea. The United States was designated as the UN's executive member nation to head and coordinate a UN military command. 20 member nations, and 2 which were not, responded to the UN's request for military assistance. The 90 days following North Korea's invasion were grim. A desperate fight for time to build UN ground and air forces in size and firepower to match the scale of the expanding war. As UN military units poured into the Republic of Korea by air and sea, enemy ground targets were pounded by our Air Force. And on the ground, heroic holding actions in places called Osan, Taejon, and Pusan gave General MacArthur and his UN command the time needed to prepare its own initiative. The UN's initiative turned out to be the bold invasion of Incheon, some 150 miles behind North Korea's lines. The surprise and daring paid off. And when elements of the 1st Cavalry Division raced 100 miles to link up with advancing 7th Infantry Division forces, North Korea's plan for unifying Korea became a nightmare. By September's end, Seoul was retaken by UN forces, and the battered capital of the Republic of Korea was returned to President Syngman Rhee. As North Korea watched its grand strategy for conquest sag and collapse, its communist leader, Kim Il-sung, would later admit that his decision to invade the South would not have been made had he believed that the United States would commit itself to such total military support and assistance. He had gambled on America being weak and lost. The 38th parallel was again crossed, but this time the momentum was northward. Was adding relentless pressure against the reeling North Korean ground forces. And new names like Kaesung and Wonsan were in the headlines as UN forces rolled on. By late October, the North Korean capital of Pyongyang was overrun, and the only question seemed to be how soon the fighting would end. Optimistic GIs said Thanksgiving. Military strategists looked toward Christmas. But as UN forces edged closer to the Yalu, weather and North Korean resistance became bitter, and Thanksgiving turned out to be Korean style. And then came Communist China's own Thanksgiving surprise, giving the world 1950's second shock, as waves of men and equipment poured across China's border into North Korea to again change the entire scope of the war. 18 Chinese divisions slammed into UN forces using massive physical and materiel superiority. The war became more savage than ever. The Chinese-directed offensive gained momentum and zeroed in on the port city of Hungnam off the Sea of Japan. Just before a grim 1950 Christmas, UN forces were evacuated from Hungnam by sea. Our Eighth Army received a new commander in General Matthew Ridgway, whose immediate concern was the 3-to-1 manpower superiority enjoyed by the combined Chinese and North Korean forces. Again, the 38th parallel was crossed as UN forces fell back, complicated by fleeing refugees who impeded UN operations. Seoul changed hands for the third time. As the winter of 50-51 turned Korea into a winter wasteland, UN forces moving against overextended enemy supply lines regained the initiative. Van Fleet replaced Ridgway, who replaced MacArthur. What was left of Seoul was retaken by UN forces. Almost 1 year after North Korea's miscalculation, a tactical stalemate developed above the 38th parallel. A new phase in the war was at hand.
In the early summer of 1951, the communist world let it be known that a ceasefire and truce were possible. They stipulated that Kaesong be the site for exploratory talks. The UN found Kaesong to be a hostile North Korean propaganda show.
Panmunjom, closer to the 38th parallel, became the compromise choice. For 2 years and 17 days, exploratory talks, numbering 255 sessions, went on, and so did the fighting. Another winter in Korea passed. Combat became limited but bloody, ravaging the already scarred Korean landscape and producing isolated battles of now famous legend, and during which acts of heroism became just as legendary. Finally, in April 1953, sick and wounded POWs were exchanged as part of Operation Little Switch. Expectations for a meaningful ceasefire spread throughout the world, and especially among the bone-weary United Nations forces. And then, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was agreed to. Across Korea, the guns would stand silent. But silent guns in Korea were not enough to preserve the Republic of Korea's existence or guarantee its people's survival. So in 1953, the United States signed a mutual defense treaty with the Republic of Korea, pledging our military aid and assistance to help peace survive and to warn any would-be aggressor that we would not allow South Korea to become a repeat victim of aggression. In spirit and practice, we have not wavered from that treaty commitment.
Because we have pledged to help peace survive in a divided country where peace has been so elusive, U.S. forces remain today as a symbol of our commitment to the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Republic of Korea and the cause of peace in that area. The uniformed Americans presently serving in Korea are there to carry out one basic mission: to deter any act of aggression against the Republic of Korea.
To the American serviceman serving in Korea, training and readiness must have more than routine attention. The Korean War and 2 decades of an often uneasy peace underline the serious and urgent need for quick, deterrent military response. In partnership with American soldiers serving in combat and support units are the more than 10,000 Republic of Korea soldiers who represent Korean augmentation to the United States Army, or KATUSAS. Begun during the Korean War, the program has grown into a dramatic demonstration as to how differing lifestyles, languages, and national customs can coexist to benefit the common purpose of both nations. And since 1950, progress within the Republic of Korea's armed forces has transformed them into one of the largest in the free world. Its Army and Air Force are combat ready, well equipped, and well trained. In recent years, the defense of South Korea has increasingly shifted to the Republic of Korea's military forces. Since March 1971, DMZ security has for the most part been carried out by South Korean soldiers, allowing our 2nd Infantry Division to stand in reserve and the veteran 7th Infantry Division to be removed from Korea and returned to the United States for inactivation.
This shifting emphasis to defensive responsibility by the Republic of Korea's armed forces does not mean a lessening of our resolve to meet our treaty commitments to the government and people of South Korea. It is, rather, a dynamic demonstration of the American doctrine at work, an independent Northeast Asian country assuming increasingly greater control of its own security and allowing a realistic reduction of U.S. military manpower and involvement in day-to-day internal affairs.
The continued presence of highly trained American servicemen in the Republic of Korea is keyed to deterring aggression. How long even one U.S. serviceman must remain in Korea depends on when turbulence and the threat of aggression against the Republic of Korea will end. The American serviceman serves in South Korea, as his counterpart does in Western Europe, as a symbol of America's intention to stem aggression and preserve peace. But there's a light side to serving in Korea today, which offers relaxing fun, adventure, and a variety of travel and recreational opportunities. Wherever you're stationed, off-duty hours or going on leave can mean places to visit with lots to do and see. There is, of course, Seoul, whose rapidly changing profile is home to 6 million inhabitants. Old and new lifestyles coexist amidst the racing pulse of this capital city, which expresses the essence of today's South Korean vitality and resurgency. By night, when business has been put aside, Seoul swings, sings, and soars. And even though a midnight curfew prevails, there's still ample time to savor the flavors of this city after dark. If culture and beauty are part of your scene, a lifetime of Korean history can be found in the historic temples and palaces scattered throughout the land. Throughout Korea, you'll be surrounded by scenic beauty, where traditional farming villages and rice paddies offer another reflection of Korea in dramatic contrast to its modern momentum. While serving in Korea, you are going to find many differences between local customs and traditions and those of the Western world. Learn to understand and respect them, and you'll enjoy them too. Be aware also that the United States and the Republic of Korea have signed a Status of Forces agreement. This means that when local law or a Korean's personal or property rights are violated by members of U.S. military forces, the Republic of Korea can try the accused in its own courts and legally sentence an American serviceman, if found guilty, to a Korean jail. By conducting yourself in accordance with national laws, your tour of duty in Korea can be most rewarding. The continuing presence of American servicemen on the soil of the Republic of Korea has contributed immeasurably to the country's security and stability. Because of their presence, peace, even though fragile, has brought economic growth, prosperity, and a sense of renewed national pride to this historically troubled land. Once again, the morning calm has been restored, and it is for that very reason that the American serviceman remains in Korea to help peace survive.